Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I have started this Quran Tafsir series in a new approach by grouping the verses by themes or main ideas. I used Ibn Kathir as my primary source of Tafsir. Let's get started. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. A key theme of Surah Fajr is time. Allah takes an oath or swears by four aspects of time. Today we will discuss who are these people of intellect that Allah is highlighting in verse 5. We will also discuss today the verses about the possessors of power and how they contrast with the possessors of spiritual intellect. Then in the center verse of this group of verses, Allah speaks about how He is the ever watchful. The topic of verses will return to talking about the same group of people who lacked understanding of Allah's purpose. Now in this surah, the end of time arrives. Time branches off differently for those who regret and for those who return to Allah. Allah mentions the word yawm several times to refer to the day of judgment. The Arabic word yawm includes day and night. Please watch the last video on the first four verses of Surah Fajr regarding Allah's swearing by the four aspects of time. When Allah swears by something, it should be the most important factor in our lives. Verse 5 is very important as it mentions the person of spiritual intellect, which contrasts with the next group of verses 6 through 13, which discusses the opposite kind of people. This person is one who possesses understanding, spiritual intellect, good reasoning, and they will understand the value of Allah's oath in the first four verses. They take Allah's oaths as evidence for them to understand the importance of the time mentioned here. Allah refers to this type of person as Zil Hijr, possessor of intellect. The intellect has been called Hijr because it prevents the person from doing what is not benefiting him. So the intellect prevents the person from acting on his nafs that prompts to make him busy with the material possessions of life and to forget Allah. It is interesting the word hijr is chosen here because it also means stone, and it contrasts with the next group of people who actually used stones to build their city structures as their main purpose of life while opposing the messengers of Allah. We see something in common in this group of verses. They all refer to nations that were arrogant and built their lofty cities with stones and carved rocks. They did not remember Allah and actually opposed their messengers and caused corruption in their cities. Allah destroyed these nations and Allah made them legends and exemplary nations to be spoken about and to warn us. Now we will discuss these three nations in this group of verses. The first is the nation of Ad. Iram was an ancient nation who were the first people of Ad, and there are three verses about them. Allah calls this nation Dhatil Imad, possessor of pillars. The word pillars show the importance they placed in the building structure, but they rejected and opposed their messenger Hud. The likes of this kind of structures with pillars had not been constructed in their lands before, as mentioned in verse 8. Next, the people of Thamud is mentioned in verse 9, who carved out their city with sakhr, which means stones. There is one verse on Thamud and it is in the center of this group of verses. So notice before the city of Iram was built with lofty pillars and now stones are used for Thamud. Next, Allah refers to the nation of Fir'aun. and there are 3 verses about them. Fir'aun is referred to as Dhil Autad, possessor of pegs, in verse 10. Why has pegs been referred to here? Again, pointing to the pegs of the pyramid structures. These pegs mark their unique building structures and show the grandeur and glory of the pharaohs. Allah continues in verse 11 to say they oppressed and spread corruption. I hope you see that what is common with all these 3 nations was that their buildings were carved with lofty stones, pillars, and pegs. Contrast that with people of spiritual intellect, referred to as Dhil Hijr, as discussed before. Again, notice Allah used the word Hijr to represent intellect. Another meaning, as I said before, of Hijr is stone. So it creates a nice contrast with how these nations use stones to build their structures. These nations were chasing to beautify their structures while opposing the messengers of Allah and causing corruption. Now comes the final verse 13 in this group of verses, where we see that all these nations received Allah's severe and disastrous punishment. So we talked about the people who possessed spiritual intellect in verse 5. Then we spoke about the people who possessed power and built nations in this group of verses 6 through 13. Right in the center of this entire group of verses, in verse 14, Allah mentions that He is ever watchful. Allah watches the movements and activities of these nations. Now the topic will go to discussing the characteristics of the people who lacked spiritual intellect, which is the reason why they're just chasing materialism and forgetting Allah. We will continue explaining Surah Fajr in the next video. If you have benefited from this video, please like, subscribe, comment, and keep watching this series. Please also check out my book on Amazon, where I explore the verse connections of Surah Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran as shown here in this picture. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.